Hello everybody and welcome back to the next tutorial in web penetration testing. Right now we will start off by covering some of the basics of SQL and the basics of SQL injection. So first of all, for those of you who don't know, with the SQL injection we basically make an interaction with the database itself. Now the database is mostly used to store information, for example usernames and passwords can be stored in database, and once you type them in a form, the server queries the database and compares password you typed in with the password stored in the database, and if they match, it will allow you to log in. So the example would be, for any login form that you encounter, whether it is on the Instagram, Twitter or any social media account, what it will do is once you type it in, it will make a query to the SQL database, and it will compare, first of all, it will probably hash your password and compare the hash password with the hash password stored in the database, and if they match, you will be able to log in. So the problem here happens if the person who created that website didn't filter the user input well enough and didn't forbid some of the characters used to query the database. Now it can potentially allow the user to send SQL queries and gather a bunch of the information that he shouldn't really gather. It can also allow the user to delete the entire database if he wanted to. Now before we begin, let me just open LeafPad right here and explain a little bit more what SQL is and how you query the database. First of all, the database is just a bunch of tables that are connected with the same system and that are also connected between each other. Now, what I mean by tables is basically a table is a list that contains information for the same type of elements, for example, table of users. So you have Facebook.com, for example, and it probably has a database with a bunch of tables of users. And the tables are basically consisted of rows and columns. So for example, you could have the row of user, then below row of password for user, then below row of some of the other information for user, mobile phone, email, or basically any other information you want. It doesn't have to be anything linked with the user itself. It could be, for example, you visit an online shop and it sells I don't know, flowers, for example, and you could have a table of different types of flowers right there and different types of information for those flowers. And once you search the online shop, it queries for that database. Now, how do we query a database? How do we actually interact with the database itself? Now, there is the SQL language. It is not that hard to learn, but in the SQL injection, it might seem a little tricky to get used to it, but once you learn some of the basic commands, it is not that hard to continue learning it. Now, some of the top commands would be create, select, update, insert, delete, drop. Now, these commands are used to query the database, and they basically do as they say. Create will create database, select will select a specific, for example, table in that database, or specific column or row, it doesn't matter. Update will basically update the database. Insert will insert a new element to the database or to the table itself. And delete will delete a certain part of the database. For example, you want to delete a user. He decided to, for example, close the account and you want to delete it from the database, you will do it with the delete command. And drop basically deletes the entire database itself. It can be very dangerous if the site is vulnerable to the SQL injection. So for example, let's say the Facebook was vulnerable to the SQL injection, and you just type there drop and the name of the database, you would basically delete the entire database of users and passwords. which would become a really big problem. But luckily, Facebook is not vulnerable to the SQL injection, and most of the bigger websites aren't vulnerable to the SQL injection, but some of the less known websites could be. So, also, one more thing, the commands delete and drop are not really used that much by the attacker, since loss of information is not the preferred method of the attack itself, since attacker in most cases wants to gather information and not delete them. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the attacker. Valuable to the attacker is the passwords and usernames that he could gather for that account, than deleting every account. If he deleted every account, he would just make a big problem, but if he gathered all usernames and passwords, he could basically log in as anybody to that website. And that could prevent a huge problem if that website with, for example, PayPal. He could send a bunch of money to himself, and he would probably get caught after some time, but that isn't the point right here. Now, the command out of all of these that you will use always is the select command. So this command is used to query the database. So, for example, you found out the SQL injection, you want to select the table with the passwords. You would do that with this command. Now, the basic SQL query will look something like this. So, select, and then some kind of elements from table where condition. So, this is the basic query for the SQL database. We select some elements from some table where and then a certain condition. Now, the type of that, the example for this command would be something like this. Let's say select name, description, price from products where price is less than $5.99. For example, now this is the basic query database for a website that would possibly be some kind of the online shop. So we select the name of the product that we are searching for, the description of that name, and the price of that name from all of the products where price is less than $5.99. And then once the user selects that somewhere, the server prints out back all of the responses that are below $5.99 and that have name, description, and price with them. So, it doesn't have to be a single thing that we specify right here. We can specify two things. So, for example, you could just type select from column A. So we want to select column A from table X, where some other column E equals employee, and column F basically equals 100. Now, as you can see, you can also use these logical conditions, which basically allows us to set two things right here. So we select column A from table X, where column E equals employee and column F equals 100. So this is how the basic SQL query looks like. Now, you might find it a little bit tricky, but you should be able to understand it. If you don't, however, just search on the internet some of the SQL basics and you will get used to it real fast. It is one of the easier languages, but its syntax can be a little bit weird. As we can see right here, this select from and where is typed in, I typed it in capital letters. You don't have to if you don't want to. I just wanted to type it in capital so I can show you the different parts of it. So this column A is the part of the database, this table X is part of the database, the column E is also part of the database. That's why I typed it in the lower letters, and the select from and where and end are basically conditions that we use to query the database. Now that I show you some of the basics of the SQL, I just want to let us just continue in the next lecture with the exploitation and the attack of the SQL injection on our OS virtual machine. So this was about it for this lecture. As I said, if you want to, just check out on the internet about SQL more, and I will see you in the next video where we will be attacking our first target. So I hope I see you there, and take care.